Chicago misconceptions and the dark side of entertainment history. Ooh, spooky. We're going to go through a few different places in this talk today, and we're going to stick around the early 1900s for the most part of it. And we're not going to talk just about theme parks and roller coasters, but we're definitely going to start there and almost end there. So, Chicago, if you guys didn't already realize this, around the turn of the century, around 1900 or so, was kind of an amusement park capital in the United States. Amusement parks are still pretty fresh, pretty brand new at that point in time. A lot of them had been inspired by things like the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition. People saw the popularity of the Midway there, where, they had a bunch of sideshows, fun entertainment, the Ferris wheel, so rides you could go on. And entrepreneurs around the country saw this and thought, that was really popular, but that fair was only around for a year. I bet if I built a permanent place for entertainment, a lot of people would come and we could open it for the summer season year after year after year. So happened everywhere, happened especially in Chicago around about 1900. And there were a lot of different amusement parks in the city at that point in time. A lot of them are not as familiar to folks today, like Joyland, Sanssouci, not names you're not necessarily remember nowadays. White City, maybe you've heard of, but I bet you guys all have heard of Riverview, yes? Everyone's nodding, and everyone who hasn't heard of it is still just like, yep, I know Riverview. Of course I know Riverview. So Riverview was the longest running of all of the amusement parks in Chicago. It opened in 1904, and it lasted until 1967. Most amusement parks closed down 1910s through 1930s or so. So this is pretty long run, a little over 60 years there. So when Riverview first opened, it was Riverview Sharpshooters Park. It was at the corner of Belmont and Western, and it was alongside the river. And it was run by a German association. They had like a shooting range set up there. And 1904, they started adding in some entertainment in there, like a merry-go-round and Shoot the Chutes, which was one of the very popular log flume rides that they had. And they added these rides in because as the men were shooting, their wives and kids were like, oh, I'm bored. So they added some entertainment, started advertising it. It became Riverview Park. You can see this advertisement for it. This was from the Inter-Ocean in 1914, I believe. So some of the fun things you could go see at Riverview there, all of these nice rides. Does the clicker work? No. Foil. Good thing we have this. Here's another view of Riverview. You've got that giant building with all the American flags on it. One popular thing you could go to Riverview for back in the day were these shows where they would have recreations of famous events. So this building here is showing the recreation of the battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack, which is like a ship fight. I don't know how a ship fight inside of a building like this would have worked, but I definitely want to see it. And you'll notice in the background, too, on the left-hand side, that is the Shoot the Chutes there hanging out. If you went to Riverview, very popular. As you can see here, this photo from the 1920s or so, advertising a 75th anniversary picnic for I don't know what group, but some group. They had a lot of groups that would set up there. You can also see the casino on the side where you could hear music, eat some food. In the 1920s, Chicago Tribune noted that you could also definitely do some gambling that wasn't really legal at the casino, but a lot of money went in and out of gamblers' pockets for that. And Tribune also noted that, scandalously, they would also take money for kids that were gambling, and they didn't care if it was men or women. It's a little bit of dark side there, but just a little bit. So here's the 1960s photos of the Shoot the Chutes. We see the front rows already immediately against this ride. This is one of the most popular ones. This is there from when Riverview opened until it closed in 1967. Leave this one's for me. Oh, thank you. It's not Prohibition anymore. That was 100 years ago. Talk about that a little bit. So Shoot the Chutes, this is one of the most popular rides. Like I said, it was open in Riverview from when it opened until when it closed. It's one of the last things you can go see in Riverview today. If you go to that location, the whole place has been raised. There's a shopping center, sports fields there, and if you go in the very back by the river, there's a dirt bike path, and if you look around and you know what to look for, you can actually find some of the cement foundations from where the boats would go through. cool little thing. I've checked out there before once. But early amusement parks. I think you guys in the front row were right to look at this and go, no. Because early 1900s roller coasters are a brand new thing. How safe do you think they were? Thumbs down. They were okay. They weren't terrible, but you definitely had more risks than you would see today on modern roller coasters. One of the earliest issues with roller coasters in Riverview actually happened with Shoot the Chutes, and it happened just a couple years after it opened, about 1906 or so. And how this ride would load up at the time is people would get in this little boat car, and then it would go through an elevator that would go to the top, and then it would splash down into the water. So at one point, the elevator was going up with a car full of people when something broke and the whole thing just tipped out and dumped everyone out on the ground. That is like the easiest roller coaster accident we're talking about today. So this is going to be a fun talk if you're already giving me that reaction. So not too bad. (1910). There were about 30 people injured in one night between accidents on two different roller coasters. It was the Royal Gorge and the Derby. The park later said that these cars were having issues, caused these accidents, caused these injuries because the tracks were wet. I feel like you should have a roller coaster that can deal with wet tracks, but again, that's like 1910 or so. Now, one of the first deaths in Riverview occurred in 1921 on a ride called the Big Dipper. As you can see here, J.A. Moody, only 22 years old, stood up on the ride and he fell out and he ended up passing away. I agree, don't stand up. But these are early roller coasters. Safety mechanisms, not necessarily in place because until it happens, you don't necessarily think that it ever will happen, right? You don't need to have a lap bar because who would be dumb enough to stand up? People find ways, right? You don't need the lap bar because as it goes across the turn, obviously you can hold on and you're not going to fall out, right? But then people don't hold on, they fall out, they pass away. That happened at the Sanssouci Park. Well, he was dead. Dark humor. Yeah, I'm guessing if they disappeared, my guess is they didn't want to be involved with it, or they didn't want to get involved with the cops, or maybe they didn't know this guy very well, and they were just like, I can't, no, and they were gone. Yeah. And if they were young, I mean, if you're like early 20s and an accident like this happens, right, your reaction might not be the most logical thing, and running away is definitely a possibility here. I don't necessarily blame them. Best of all, though, is, worst of all, maybe, this ride between the 1920s and 1930s killed 6 people. There was even an accident at one point in time where a guy riding the roller coaster ended up accidentally kicking a police officer next to him and shooting off his gun. So... So one of the rides that was at Riverview for a long time was called the Stratostrat or the Aerostrat, and this is one version of it here. And there's a few sources I've seen, but I haven't seen any of the first-hand sources talking about an accident with this ride in which the cables broke, because it's one of those where you ride it and it's like a swing ride and it goes in a circle, right, and you fly out. So they said while it was in motion, the cables broke and the car flew into the river and the 2 people in it drowned. But I haven't found first-hand sources for that. But there definitely was at least one accident with this ride where the cables snapped and 8 people ended up injured as they fell out of the ride. They did not pass away, fortunately, but they were injured. I believe one of the women injured in this accident also ended up suing the park for about $10,000. She won. She was only awarded about $3,600 or so, but she did get some money out of that, at least. Here's another version of what that ride looked like in the 1960s. I love this photo just looking at the expression on everyone's faces. That woman in the back is not sure. I love the woman in like the tank top with the sunglasses. She looks like she is a mom and she is over the amusement park day. And then I love the two girls in front of her dressed in matching outfits with the long pigtails. It's super cute. So this was 1936 when that accident happened that dumped 8 people out of this ride. Probably the biggest accident that ever happened with the roller coasters at River, though, occurred in 1937, and it occurred on this ride. This ride had a few different names over the years. It was called the Pippin in 1937 when this happened. Here you can see it's called the Silver Flash. It was also called the Flash for a while. And you'll see you have that incline going straight up, and there is a car. It looks like a 1930s streamlined modern train. It's a pretty cool little car to get to ride in. But apparently on this day, something failed with it. And as it was going up the incline, something broke and it rolled all the way down backwards. Some people tried to jump out of it, escape. They were injured. And unfortunately, like many roller coasters, this one did not have just one car going around the track. It had several. So as it broke and it fell down to the bottom of the incline, the car coming up behind it could not stop, so it crashed into it. So no one passed away from this accident, but it did injure 22 people. At least 22 people. Now, all of this is kind of early in Riverview's history. By the time you get to the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, they're really trying to emphasize how safe this park actually is. 1951, they're bragging about how they only had 0.54 accidents. I think that's per 100,000 people the year before. And they were in the middle of a 7-year no-death streak. It's pretty good. By 1960, they had 0.07 deaths or accidents between 0.07 accidents for every 100,000 people who came to the park. So that's not too bad. But probably my favorite thing that they did trying to emphasize safety came from the early 1950s when they were talking about all the preparations that they had to do for reopening the park every year. It opened second weekend of May, closed at the end of the summer, and they announced that they were filling all of the roller coaster cars with 7,200 pounds in sandbags, and then they would run all of the cars around 3 times per roller coaster just to test it, make sure everything was fine as it reopened for the summer season. But the 7,200 pounds in sandbags was new. Does anyone want to guess what they used before that? People. Yeah, the employees. And they said they didn't like this because the employees would ride the roller coasters too much and they would get sick and then throw up everywhere. So they switched to the sandbags and it was better and safer. Yeah. All this being said, it's definitely safer to go to Riverview 1950s, 1960s, but accidents still happened. So you can see in this giant headline, the article for this was pretty small compared to that headline font, to be honest. But this is from 1962 when 36-year-old Vincent Perry was killed. He was on a ride, and his wife was watching him from the ground, and as he was at the top of the ride, he managed to stand up, waved to his wife, and then he fell out and unfortunately passed away once he hit the ground. Yeah. So like lap bars and everything there for a reason. You should stay in there. He's not the only guy that this happened to. A few years before that, there was another man who was on a roller coaster called the Fireball, and he had a bad back. So apparently he decided to go on the roller coaster like braced but not fully sitting down, and he ended up falling out as well. Yeah. Oh, yes. So let's step back in time a little bit. Early days of Riverview. They have these giant buildings and they have these recreations of historical events and cool things that you could go watch. Does anyone want to read what this says, what you could go see? The Battle of Gettysburg, and below that, the sinking of the Titanic, yes. The sinking of the Titanic, as you can see right here, Riverview's leading sensation. This was a performance that opened for the 1912 season, and it ran through to 1916. They spent $150,000 on it at the time to open it. So this opened the summer of 1912. Does anyone know when the Titanic sank? April of 1912. We got to get right on that, yeah. April of 1912. So I post about Chicago history stuff on TikTok every day and on Instagram occasionally, and I posted about this and I posted it to my Instagram, and someone responded to it and said this would be the same thing if like Chicago opened a 9/11 recreation in 2001. Yes. Yeah. So I guess goes to show you that people have always had this fascination with, you know, how others meet their end, as we all have today in this talk, right? So here's another view of the sinking of the Titanic exhibit. Very popular. Sinking of the Titanic. Oh, yes. So one of the other fun exhibits, this isn't a disaster, this is just funny and I wanted to share it, was something that they had called the War of the Worlds. This is what the entrance looked like. How badass is this? I am going to this event, whatever is going on. You've got that blimp in the middle, which is really cool. You've got this explosion, it looks like, on top. Giant dolphin dragon thing on the ground there. War of the Worlds. So this performance was apparently every country in the world, plus the armies of Mars, unified to fight the United States. That was the premise. So they battled the United States, they destroyed New York City, and then they called a truce and peace, and that was the end of the show. So I just love, I just love that as Chicagoans, we're like, the US will go up against everyone, get rid of New York, we're good. So, what a happy ending, yeah. Now we can take a slight pause as I go to my other section of notes here. Wait, no, notes. Photos. Here we go. White City spooky head. I mean, is this not a spooky head? So the White City. This was another one of Chicago's early amusement parks that had more issues than Riverview for sure, in a myriad of different ways. So this was a head that was posted on the front of one of their buildings there. White City opened in 1905 at the corner of 63rd and Parkway, which is now 63rd and Martin Luther King. And the people who opened it were directly influenced by the Midway at the World's Fair. That's where they got the name White City, because the World's Fair had the nickname of the White City, so they said, hey, we're just going to copy that whole aesthetic, named it White City. One of the big standout things for the White City was the electric tower that you can see here. This apparently had, I think it was something like 20,000 or 200,000 lights, 2-something-thousand lights on it, and you could see it for 15 miles around. So a huge beacon to attract people. There's the electric tower by moonlight, as you can see, for the White City. So opened 1905, ended up closing mid-1930s or so, and their rides had some more issues, I would say. This ride was not one that had many issues. So this is just a wooden slide, as you can see, and one of the early rides at White City was a wooden slide with bumps that was very imaginatively named The Bumps. So from opening year, newspapers talking about going to opening night, White City, 1905, for The Bumps, they said people would go down it, quote, with as much dignity as possible, and generally arrived in a tangle of arms and legs to the great merriment of the spectators. There were even a few women who went down the slide frantically holding on to their petticoats. My favorite review, though, in this whole talk is from this next woman. She's unnamed, just as one woman said, quote, I reviewed my past life between the first and second bumps, and I prepared to die at the third. It's a great review, and I love how thrilling this ride was for 1905. There you go, woman tells of the bumps. Wait till she sees the Titanic, yeah. We'll talk about some of the shows you could see at White City in a little bit. Before we talk about that, though, I want to talk about this ride specifically, which was the Scenic Railway. And the Scenic Railway had issues, especially when it first opened, 1905, 1906. So 1905, again, this is when White City opens up. There was a man in July of that year who ended up falling off of the scenic railway and passed away. The park later said, oh, he was drunk. So basically threw it on him, not a safety issue on their part. And a week later, there was another accident with the scenic railway. Now, how this ride was set up was they had 2 tracks that would like run in parallel, so you could have cars on each track. And as you rode it, you would go around each track once. So they had a car full of people, and they were going up an incline. There was some shudder, something happened, they didn't know what. They said the driver was like, this is not right, hold on. And the car ended up sliding down backwards. It crashed. People were spilled out of the car. People tried to jump out of the car, that sort of thing. Now, right as this happened, there was a man who was in the last car. He was 19 years old. His name was Leo Reynolds. And as the car crashed down, he managed to stand up, get out of the car, and he stepped onto the next track where another car was coming down. And so he ended up losing his life that way. So once this happened, the city kind of stepped in with the police officers, and they decided to shut down the ride because they wanted to re-inspect it, figure out what was going on. Chief of Police O'Neill at the time decided to revoke the permit for the ride for the scenic railway, saying, quote, it had too much of a record in the way of killing people. It did reopen. This is an article from opening of 1906, so the very next year, and it was another accident on the scenic railway once again. No one died in this accident, but people were injured. So not the safest ride to go on. But I love how they're like saying, crash opens the White City, panic among merrymakers, start of season, otherwise good. Here's another kind of blurry postcard view of the scenic railway. I can't really tell what's going on here, but you can see people in 2 levels of cars on 2 levels of tracks. It looks like a giant wedding cake or something. I don't know. So yeah, issues with the White City. One other one I'll mention briefly is from 1910, where a man named Frank O'Connor fell off one of the roller coasters, doesn't say which one, and they just said that his skull was crushed and he'd passed away from this. But the park at the time did not shut down the roller coaster that night. They kept it open, but word spread pretty quickly that someone had just died on the ride, so by the end of the night, no one was there anyway. They all just immediately avoided. So not always the safest going to these early amusement parks. So this was the fun show that you could see at White City back in the day, and this was called the Fire Show. It was kind of like a recreation inspiration of the Chicago fire, but at least that had happened like 30, 40 years prior and not 2 months prior compared to the sinking of the Titanic. So you get a little bit more time there. And the Fire Show ran twice nightly, and they would like drop a giant curtain and you would see this, and it was a whole like city scene set up, and they said, describing it, you would watch like a saloon owner kick a drunk man out of his bar onto the street. You'd see women running errands. There were newsboys who were trying to sell newspapers, people with, vending carts selling fruits, vegetables, whatever. And then eventually there would be some fire that would start coming out of the tops of the buildings. People would start screaming and panicking, and then you would watch as the fire trucks came up. So you can see them really well in this photo here where it says White City, fire department, and then on the left-hand side you can see the old fire cart, which I think is really interesting. And here's a postcard recreation of that so you can really see how on fire it is. So yeah, they would have a controlled fire inside these buildings twice a night, every night. They'd have people lean out of the windows and scream frantically and then jump into the firemen's safety nets to be saved. And then the firemen would put out the fire, and then they would shoo everyone away and reset it up again for the next show. So this was the Chicago Fire Show. Kind of interesting, I think. Maybe a little bit ominous compared to the end of White City, or reminiscent of the end. I love this photo so much. That's the fun ride. So this was actually mostly safe ride, mostly safe. This is a blimp. It looks like a giant floating earthworm. Maybe something else if you want to think about that. And when I saw this in the archive, I didn't know this was a thing, and I was just like, what the hell is this? So it looks fake, but it's not fake. It's a real thing. So this is a blimp that was called the White City Eagle, and it was piloted by a man named Horace B. Wild, which is a fantastic name for an aeronaut, Horace B. Wild. So you can see one man up there, and I believe that's got to be Horace, and like this weird little contraption that he's barely balanced on. Apparently this thing was powered, I think, by like a motorcycle engine. So a very early blimp. And to show that this isn't a fake thing, here's more of it flying over the city with these men watching. It looks like the Oscar Mayer wiener. It does. A giant floating one, yes. Here's it tethered back down to earth. And you can see a little bit of the name here, the White City Eagle. So this was a blimp. White City had like basically an airplane hangar where you could build giant blimps. They had an airstrip so you could take off and land there. And from pretty much right when they opened, like these photos are from about 1906 or so, they were advertising that you could go see these blimps just like the Wright brothers take off, fly around, and land. Now they advertised this not necessarily as a ride that you could go on, and it was a lot more of like watch the cool flying thing because this is the brand new technology. But there were other people who ran blimps outside of White City who did offer rides. There was a man named Nabenshaw, I forget his first name, but in 1914, 1915, he had another blimp that was called the White City that looked much nicer than this one, more blimp-like and less this-like. And he would actually take people up on rides. Apparently it was $25 per seat to go on a ride, which is somewhere around like $800 today. So it was not a cheap excursion, but you could go on it. Now, apparently these were pretty safe, fairly safe activity, right? You're just watching these blimps go up. But the one exception to that, of course, tied to the White City and blimps is the Wingfoot Express. Any of you guys heard of the Wingfoot Express before? A couple people, okay. Oh no, indeed. So the Wingfoot Express was the first Goodyear blimp. They built it at the White City, and part of its function was going to be taking people from the White City over to the airstrip at Grant Park and back. So it would be, again, another ride you could pay for. You could watch it take off. And in July of 1919, they were going through some test flights of this blimp. It had gone through 2 successfully during the day, no problems at all. They decided to test it one more time. And they had 5 people on board. The pilot was an experienced pilot, experienced with blimps. He felt safe taking people up there. They had a promoter for the White City that was on board. They had a photographer for the Chicago Daily News on board too, because he was really excited that they were going to circle around downtown and he could get some aerial 1919 shots of downtown Chicago. Now, unfortunately, just after 4 p.m., it was a Monday afternoon, as the blimp was above the corner of Jackson and LaSalle, the pilot saw something out of the corner of his eye. He looked backwards and he realized that the blimp was on fire and it was rapidly being consumed. So he just ended up kind of turning to everyone else and saying, you have parachutes, you need to put them on, you need to jump now, because he knew the thing was going to crash pretty much instantly. So he managed to jump off of the Wingfoot, and he did survive. Everyone else tried to get their parachutes on, tried to jump out, but they weren't necessarily as lucky. The Chicago Daily News photographer ended up crashing into a building downtown. He broke both of his legs. He survived for a few days, but he ended up passing away after that. Other people who tried to jump out of the blimp ended up tangled in like parts of the carriage underneath the blimp, so they crashed with it. Now, the blimp at the time was above the Illinois Trust and Savings Bank, and they had a giant metal and glass skylight. There were no customers in the bank at the time. It was just employees trying to wrap up for the day, but I can't imagine just trying to go home. It's a hot summer afternoon, and then all of a sudden it gets dark. You go, what's that? And then all of the glass and iron and a blimp starts falling down on you. So it was chaos as people were trying to escape. One quote I read that I will always remember is someone said as they were running for the exits, they heard someone else yell, "Oh my God, it's raining hell," because it was just flaming bits of blimp that was coming down on top of the bank. So this is what the interior of the bank looked like afterwards. There are about 13 people who passed away between on the blimp and then just being at work in the bank. The bank the next day opened business as usual, 9 a.m., and they held 5 minutes of silence for everyone who passed away at lunchtime. It's a very Chicago thing to do with these big disasters. People just kind of get straight back into it, to remember what happened, and then just move forward. I mean, that's what we did after Chicago fire, right? And they did the same thing here with this Wingfoot Express. So watching the blimps, fairly safe back then. Riding them, fairly safe unless you wanted to ride the Wingfoot Express, then not very safe. Well, you might be safe on the ground watching these shows. It doesn't necessarily mean if you're going to an air show, you're not going to see something that will scar you for life. So this is Ruth Law. And Ruth Law was a very early pilot. She was one of the first female pilots out there, and she is a total badass. One of these days, I really want to do like a whole talk on her because everything I found out about her is amazing. She wrote to the Wright brothers saying she wanted to learn how to build and fly planes, and Orville Wright wrote back to her and told her that women don't have mechanical minds, so he refused to do anything with her. She was quoted as saying, the surest way to make me do a thing is to tell me I cannot do it. So she ended up having her brother buy a plane from him. She took the plane, she learned how to work it, how to build it, how to fly it. She was the first woman to fly at night. She was the first person to fly from Chicago to New York City. She was the first woman to do loop-de-loops in the air where you just fly upside down as parts of shows. This is Ruth outside of an airplane. And she actually did go over to Europe, too, during World War I. She wanted to be a pilot and fight for the cause, but of course the US government said, you're a woman, you can't be an aircraft pilot, so she did not do that. After World War I, though, she decided to start Ruth Law's Flying Circus. So here is her with her group of flying circus men. And this was in the era where, of course, these kind of barnstorming shows are really popular all over the country. And it is crazy people doing crazy, dangerous tricks in early aircraft. So if you were involved in this business, there was a pretty good chance that you were not going to retire from this business. So Ruth here, when she traveled around, there was one young man who was just a teenager when she started working with him, and his name was Louis James. And I believe he's one of the men here. I'm not entirely sure. My guess is he's probably the guy who's sitting on the car doing this, but I'm not entirely sure. Now, one of the tricks that Louis and Ruth had together is Louis would be in the car as a passenger, and the car would be going around a track, and then Ruth would fly above him, keep pace with the car, drop a ladder. So he would climb out of the car, grab the ladder, climb up the ladder as she soared up higher, and then he would climb into the airplane. It's a pretty cool trick, if you do it right. Now, Ruth actually retired from her flying circus in 1922. She retired because she woke up one morning and read a notice in the newspaper of her retirement because her husband was tired of her doing all these very dangerous things. So he forcibly retired her. She decided, okay, it's time. And I think kind of always regretted that decision. It was said that she had a nervous breakdown in the 1930s and attributed part of that to not being able to fly anymore. But she is also one of the few people who did all these crazy things and actually survived to old age. She died when she was in her 80s. Louis James was not so lucky. While Ruth Law's flying circus retired, a few months later, he started doing other tricks, working with other people. And there was an air show festival that was happening in Homewood, so just outside the city of Chicago. And he was going to be doing basically the same trick where he would go from the car to the plane with a ladder, but instead he was going to be going from a plane to another plane on the ladder, so they would both be up high. Now, on this day, he had tried this trick several times already, and things just weren't quite working out, wasn't feeling right, I don't know what. So his friends and his fiance who were there with him were like, you don't have to do this today. And he said no, he still wanted to do it. It was supposed to be part of the show, part of the festival. So he decided to go up one last time to transfer to the other plane. And as they were doing this, plane on top, holding the ladder, got in close. He reached for it, couldn't quite grab it, flew away, came in a second time, reached for it, didn't quite grab it. Plane came in a third time, was just about to pull away when he saw that Louis had actually grabbed the rungs and was starting to climb up. But just as he left this car, there was a gust of wind that blew him and the ladder into the propeller of the plane he had just been flying on. Here's a helpful diagram from the paper. Was he okay? He would not have felt any pain. He was gone pretty much instantly. I like in this drawing, too, how you have this woman being like, I don't want to look, but I kind of want to look. So yeah, showing what happened there to poor Lewis James. So this is Lewis James. I love this caption, too. Lewis James, aviator, ground to pieces in an airplane propeller. This is his fiance that watched all of this happen. Yeah. So you're not in the plane, this won't happen to you, but this would be a very traumatic thing if we all saw this happen and we're expecting something nice. Most terrifying of all is this wasn't even the only death that happened at this aeronautics festival. The very next day, a plane landed and a 15-year-old kid started running up to the plane, went past the barrier that was set up, and he ended up also dying in the propeller of the plane. So some danger. Now, White City suffered some setbacks. Late 1920s, couldn't really recover from them. So this photo is from 1927 after there was a massive fire in the park. And this fire ended up taking out that electric tower full of lights. They never rebuilt it. The park never really recovered from the Great Depression either. Eventually, the owners went bankrupt. The place was kind of left alone, and it was torn down. And they built the Parkway Gardens there instead. Now, one of the last parts of the White City to survive over the years was the White City roller rink. This was not torn down. It was not affected by the fires. It operated as an independent entity. But the White City roller rink in the 1940s, 1950s was a segregated roller rink. And they operated under what was called club rules at the time. So they basically said, we're an exclusive club. You have to be a member if you want to come and roller skate here. Sorry, our membership is closed. So 1940s, there were about 25 different groups that banded together to protest against the segregation that was happening at the White City roller rink. This was led by CORE. And they would send in people, so, they would send in white people to the roller rink to see if they could get in, and these white people were not members. And of course, they would be sold tickets, they would be able to rent skates, do whatever, go roller skate, and then they would send in black people who were also not members, and the black people would immediately be told, sorry, this is a club, you can't come in here, membership is closed. So they started picketing all the time outside of the White City. They started sending out pamphlets to the neighborhood saying, do you know who these people are? Do you know what they're doing? Do you know how they are discriminating against black people here in the city of Chicago? This went on for weeks and weeks and weeks, to the point where the owners of the White City ended up suing the people picketing, saying, hey, we're losing a lot of money because of all of you. They said the revenue was down 50% and white people didn't want to go skate there anymore, which is kind of the point, right? So they brought this suit to court, and the judge ended up throwing out the suit because they said, well, you claim you're a club, but you don't take any membership dues. You don't actually have any official members. You are just doing this so that you can keep the club segregated. All of this wouldn't be an issue if you would just let black people come and roller skate here. The owners of the White City said in response to this that if they had to let black people in, that meant they would also have to let hoodlums in there to skate, and it would scare away the rest of their white clientele. So they did not want to do this. So the picketing continued at White City. It was now officially legal and sanctioned for them to do that. They weren't going to be sued again. And eventually the owners of the White City roller rink said, okay, we can't do this anymore. We agree. We're going to not be a club, and we're going to integrate the roller rink for the first time. So here you can see a photo from them picketing out front of the roller rink. some articles about it as well. Chicago Committee of Racial Equality, CORE. I always forget exactly what that stands for. And then them working to integrate the roller rink. So they were able to do that at that point in time. The roller rink was renamed from White City Roller Rink to the Park City Bowl, and it operated as a roller rink throughout the 1950s, closed in 1958, and then in 1959, this last remnant of the White City also burned down. So a lot of this place burned. This is from an article from the 1950s about the White City when it closed down. It was written by Jean Bond from 1959, and I'm going to read a quote from her about it. She said, "More than a former amusement park perished November 28th when the last structure in the White City Amusement Park was destroyed by fire. White City in its heyday was like an unruly, impulsive movie queen who was often in trouble. No one objected to her flings because, most of all, she was never dull. She lived a gay life, a life sprinkled with adventurous stunts, gigantic shows, daring rides, and a number of brushes with the law. For years after she opened her doors in 1904, thousands of visitors came, hoping that some of the gaiety would rub off. Many still live in Chicago and remember." I think that's kind of an interesting quote, because I mean, this is from 59, right? And they're saying many in Chicago still remember. And at this point in time, I'm sure there's some people who remember skating at White City Roller Rink, Park City Bowl, but there's not really going to be anyone who remembers going to White City Amusement Park and riding all these rides, right? That closed in the early 30s. It's quite a long time ago. Riverview is kind of where we are now for that sort of a thing, because a lot of people still remember going to Riverview and still have lots of fond memories of going to that amusement park. Riverview, again, opened 1904, and it closed unexpectedly after its 1967 season. They'd even announced an opening date for 1968, but instead the land was sold off. It was worth a lot of money at the time, and the whole place was developed. But while a lot of people have a lot of really fond memories of Riverview today and going there as kids, it was not necessarily a place that everyone was welcome to go to back in the day. And one of the big issues at Riverview is one amusement that they had that you can see a photo of here that was called the Dip. And this was an attraction that was actually pretty popular with amusement parks in the early 1900s. This was not just at Riverview, this was also at the White City. I believe they had versions of this at the World's Fair too. And the Dip lasted in Riverview from when it opened 1904 all the way up into the 1960s, which is a long time for a pretty problematic, quote unquote, carnival game to have. So the Dip was basically a kinder version of an older carnival and traveling circus game from the mid-1800s. And this game was called the African Dodger. Now, this game consisted of a giant piece of canvas that usually had some sort of like racist southern depiction of black people on it, and then they would hire one black man to stick his head through the canvas. He would yell insults at white men, and then there would be a barker next to them that would sell like softballs or whatever to these white men that were being insulted so that they could throw it at the black man's head. This is awful, to say the least. This is extremely dangerous. It injured people and it killed people. So the slightly nicer, kinder version of it was this, the Dip. So you can see on the bottom, they're saying 5 for a dime, boys. And this is basically a dunk tank. This is the origin of the modern dunk tank today. So how these would be set up is they would usually have 3 cages, and they would have a black man sitting in each of the cages, and then outside of the cage next to him would be a target, and these men would again start picking on all of the white men that they saw wandering around, trying to make them mad enough that they would go to the barkers, they would pay a dime to get 5 balls, and then throw it and try and dunk the men sitting in the tank. Now, half the time, these white men would be so angry that they're not necessarily just throwing it at the target, but they're throwing it directly at the men who are sitting in these cages. So this photo that you see here is actually not Riverview. You can go online and find photos of this from Riverview, but I figured one is enough for this. This is from the White City, because again, this was an attraction that was pretty popular everywhere back in the day. Now, the man that you can see in the middle there who's got his hand up, he's a reporter. His name is Oni Fred Sweet, which is an interesting name to have. And he apparently liked reporting on amusement parks, because this is an article from 1914 where he decided he was going to go and try operating all of these different amusements for the day. And this is one of the ones that he operated. But the next year he decided to take it a step further, and he actually went to Riverview, and he decided to dress in blackface and work the dip game instead. So he made friends with a guy named Mose who worked the game. He also played clarinet in a band at Riverview, and he went and sat in the dunk tank instead. So he joined the other men, singing songs, trying to taunt people. Eventually someone dunked him. He went in the water. All of the paint started to come off his face, and the proprietor said, "Who are you? I didn't hire you," and kicked him out. The proprietor then talked to him and seemed very proud about the fact that he had been operating this attraction in Riverview for the past 11 years since it opened in 1904, and went on to talk about how he went to South State Street to find young black men to sit in the dunk tank. This is a terrible game. It's awful, and it's really, really horrible that this lasted at Riverview until the early 1960s. It was finally shut down because there was enough outcry against it. The NAACP was against it. Riverview Park finally decided that they were going to actually do something about this. They really didn't care beforehand. You have newspapers like the Chicago Defender, who throughout the entire lifetime of Riverview Park are writing articles and having editorials talking about how awful this is and how it needs to be shut down. Riverview refused to do anything. There is Paul Steele, who wrote a column in the Chicago Star in 1943 talking about this, and he said it was, quote, "lynching practice 3 for a dime. Customers who so desire may release pent-up racist venom by firing regulation baseballs at a symbol of the minorities held in disdain by them." And it is. That's all it is. Riverview, in a response to people calling out this attraction and wanting it closed in the 1950s, said that, quote, "it is the private business of the park, and as long as it is patronized profitably, it will be continued." Boo. 1950s, 1960s, journalist Mike Royko goes to Riverview. He talks to people. He talks to some of the people who are running this attraction because it's still going at that point in time. And he asked why they never had any white men in the dunk tank. And the people running this basically said, well, it is integrated because they had white men selling, you know, the balls and everyone else. Yeah, so of course, right? And then they also said that they never had any white men in the dunk tanks because they only had one changing room and they couldn't have them share. It was finally shut down in the 1960s, but this was way too long for this to be going on. And this is always kind of a tough topic to talk about with Riverview because so many people do remember it fondly and they do have these childhoods that they spent going there. And that is great if that was your experience, but that was not necessarily everyone's experience going to Riverview. We're going to switch to the last topic, which is a little bit more lighthearted. Lighthearted in that we're going to talk about theater fires and bombing. So, early film, very flammable. Extremely flammable. Movies in the 1900s, extremely popular, which means you have a lot of buildings with a lot of film going in and out that is very, very explosive. I believe by like 1907, 1908 or so, Chicago was said to have more Nickelodeons, which are, you know, these tiny, quick-built storefront movie theaters like this one than any other city in the United States. And because these things are being built so quickly, because film is being made so quickly and being exchanged between all of these theaters, you had accidents that happened sometimes. For instance, 1909, there was the Woodlawn 5-cent theater, and there was a fire that started in the projection booth. It caught the rear of the theater on fire. People freaked out, didn't know where to escape. They ended up stumbling through an alley door. They were all okay, but they ended up getting bumped and bruised and leaving purses full of money and scarves and stoles and all that sort of a thing in the building. So they got out, but whew, they were very lucky that they actually got out. 1912, there was a theater that caught on fire, and the only reason that people survived that was because the fire started in the projection booth, and the owner of the theater, who was also projecting the film, managed to keep the fire contained from the rest of the film, and the piano player who was accompanying the movie kept playing piano calmly and ordered everyone out of the building calmly. So they all left calmly, and it was okay, and the theater did not explode. As you can see here, for the Ashland Theater, this is still an issue. And for the Ashland Theater, when it caught on fire, it was, again, in the projection booth. Because, of course, that's where all the film is, so that's where you're most likely to get these fires and explosions happening, right? So what happened then is they had a fire that started in the booth. The projector took all the other films he had and tried throwing them out the window on the street because he didn't want them to catch fire. There was still fire that was blasting out into the audience, though, and people freaked out and were trying to escape. And the thing about people, we all do it. The entrance we came in is where we want to exit from. So as you can see from this diagram, they have exits in the back, but no one realized that there were exits in the back, and they wanted to go back out the front where they entered. But the front is directly underneath the projection booth that's on fire. And this was the common design for these theaters that were kind of built on this like shoestring budget. They were calling them shoestring theaters here. And so the city of Chicago was like, we need to change this. We really need to have better rules on the designs of these theaters so we don't have a giant fire or explosion happen that could kill people. Now, while these did happen, there weren't any like huge film explosion theater fires, but just because you're not in a theater doesn't mean you don't have to worry about film exploding and killing you. The mayor of Berwyn in 1914 suffered this fate. So the mayor, Henry S. Rich, it's kind of a monopoly name, right? Henry Rich. So he was on a train car going back home from the city, or going back home to Berwyn from the city, and he was on a smoker car, so that's a smoking car, right? And there were two smoker cars that were attached to each other, and he was in the middle of a card game that had just started, and then all of a sudden he looked up and there was a fire. There was a man who was bringing film to a movie theater out in the suburbs. Something happened, the film caught fire, and it exploded. It blew two people out windows of the train, and this happened right when it hit the Kedzie Viaduct, and there was a man from the Vincent Casket Company who happened to look out the window and see a flaming train car go down the tracks. So he called the fire department. They were able to stop the car, get people out, rescue them, and like very temporarily put them in the neighboring businesses while they could be attended to, right? And that included the Victor Casket Company. So I'm just imagining someone who is at a card game smoking a cigarette, they get blown out the window of the train, and then they wake up in the casket company, like, not good. Yeah. So Mayor Rich here, he apparently talked to reporters after this happened. He was badly burned, and he basically told them, yeah, I don't ever want to have to do that again, but I'm okay. And then he passed away afterwards. This wasn't that okay. Here's what that train car looked like after that explosion. Also, can we talk about the fact that this guy had very flammable film that he brought into a smoking car? Not good. I forget the term of celluloid. What is it, Adam? Celluloid. Okay. I always forget what the name of it is. Yes, celluloid, oily film, extremely flammable. Now, by the time you get to the 1920s, this is kind of like calmed down. You don't hear as much about these giant film explosions or these risks happening, especially in these storefront movie theaters. Oh. But film is still explosive. And you could use it to try and run for the cops if you wanted. as it happened here. They were showing salacious scenes, yes. So this is from 1925 in Lakeview, and there were two sisters, Catherine and Josephine McGovern, and they were with another woman named Jean English, and they happened to run into two men on the street, and these men said, hey, we just rented a room in this house. We're movie producers. We make movies. Do you want to see the movies we make? And they said yes, and so they went to go watch the movies these men made in this room that they had just rented. And the women were watching, and then they were scandalized when the orphan looking for a job appeared on screen, and she was totally nude. So they were really upset about this, and one of the sisters ended up leaving the room to go straight to the police to tell on them, and these men locked the other two women in there. So this is not going well. So the one sister returned with the police. The door was locked. The police couldn't get in there, and when they finally got through to the door, these two men saw what happened with Uno, and then they tossed a lighted match on the film, caused an explosion, and no one was seriously injured in this, but it caused a lot of damage to the building. And these men were then arrested for producing indecent movies. I just love that I found this, because you never hear about indecent films from the 1920s, not too much. And it's oh, scandal. Oh. So this is Tommy Molloy. And if you were in a theater in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and a bomb went off, there is a good chance that you could blame this man for it. So Tommy Molloy was the head of a projectionist union in the city of Chicago. And he had pretty much absolute power and ruled it with an iron fist. He had already been working as a driver for some pretty shady people, and he had been working as a projectionist in a theater one day when the union was trying to figure out who they wanted to have in charge next. Now, they decided to elect him because as he was working as a projectionist, two guys came in the booth to rob him, and he ended up kicking in their teeth, stealing their guns, and chasing them down the street. So they're this man. But he had a lot of really shady dealings. This is a map detailing out some of the murders that happened around him. All of these black that you see, these are bombs. These are bombs that were set off and attributed to him and the union at different theaters. And the skulls, yep. Yeah. The skull indicates someone who was against him in power in the union who ended up shot to death, and no one could figure out what happened. So he would force theater owners to use only projectionists from his union. If they refused, they might end up beaten, killed, and or their theaters bombed. He also had the union that he ruled over, and as movies gained in popularity and theaters boomed and you needed more projectionists to join the union books were always closed and they were never accepting new members. So to get around this, if you were non-union and you wanted to work as a projectionist, you could get a permit that he would issue that would okay you to work as a non-union member in a theater. But if this was happening, then you had to pay the union 10% of what you made. And then, of course, he took all of that money and pocketed it. And if you were a union member, well, you aren't going to get the high-paying jobs because those are going to the non-union members because more of that money is going back to Tommy Molloy. So yeah, he was pretty dirty and fought with bombs a lot. Theater owners put up with him because they needed the projectionists. I was hoping to get this scrolled up a little bit. There we go. Just so you can see. Oh, there we go. High spots in the career of Tommy Molloy. Killings, shootings, and sluggings, bombs, fire, extortions, gambling, union headquarters, Molloy's home, motion picture theaters. So yeah, the theaters tried to break him and the union. Basically, in 1927, they refused to open if it was one of his projectionists working, and most theaters in the city of Chicago ended up closed for about a month. They lost almost $2 million in profits, ended up being forced to reopen for Labor Day weekend. He did not concede anything at that point in time, so he continued to extort money from the theaters and the union itself. 1930s, 1931 or so is when a lot of these bombings happened. That summer of 1931, there were about 15 or so that happened happen around the city because the theaters decided they weren't going to use these union projectors, and they instead imported people from New York City. They flew them in on private planes. They had some of them come in trains, and on a stopover in Gary, these projectors from New York City ran into people at the station who told them it would be bad for their health if they continued to Chicago and worked as projectionists. So some of them went home, some of them stayed here. He also did things like have some of his friends on the books working these nice projectionist jobs. So this is Dr. Emmett C. Quinn, who was a dentist. I don't know why he would also need a projectionist job, but he was hired to be a projectionist at the Chicago Theater, earning $130 a week, which is something like $2,500 a week today. He never worked his shifts, and everyone else worked his shifts for him. This is a diagram from the newspapers about one of those bombs that they tried to set off on the Monroe Theater downtown, summer 1931. So you can see where it says 1 there, that's where some guy threw a bomb, was accidentally exploded at point 2 midair, but he was actually trying to throw it into this exhaust pipe there that led straight into the projection booth for the Monroe Theater, so that he would blow up those New York City projectionists. Now, this was a very lucrative business for Tommy Molloy. And in general, in the 1920s, the gangs kind of knew what was going on, but they weren't like super trying to take him down because alcohol is a bigger business at the time, and they're more concerned about that. There was an incident in 1927 where Fred and Frank Gusenberg, who would then later go on to be killed in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, tried to get their brother hired as the head of the union. He had a few people who were supporting him, but instead Molloy made an agreement with the Gusenbergs. His brother got a really nice, cushy, high-paying job at the union instead. He remained as the head, and one of the other union members who had gone against him ended up shot. He survived, but ended up shot. Now, by the 1930s, things have changed a little bit. 1930s, prohibition is over, and gangsters need a different source of income. So they start looking at the projectionist union here, and they say, ooh, this is a lot of money. We want to be in charge of it. And Molloy did not want to concede any of the money or any of the power that he had. But Frank Nitti was one of the main people who was trying to take over the union from him. Now, everything was kind of coming down on Molloy at this point in time. The government was coming after him for tax fraud, same that they did for Al Capone. So he had just been charged and indicted with tax fraud on a lot of money. And a couple months later, he didn't have to worry about it anymore. As he was driving on Lakeshore Drive, another car came up next to him with a sawed-off shotgun. They had a couple shots to take out the driver's side window, and then they shot him multiple times. Yes. I have a photo of that if you'd like to see. It is someone who has passed away, though it is not a terribly violent photo. There's Tommy Molloy after this happened. You can see, so what I find interesting about this photo, beyond the fact that it's just Tommy Molloy lying, dead in his car, is the fact that you can see the light reflected from the window there against him. So you can get that feeling of the photographer, right? And then you can also see everyone else in the background kind of has their backs on him. Like, this is already old news. He's no longer in charge of anything. They've turned their backs on Tommy Molloy. They're moving forward. So that kind of brings me to the end of the talk here. Dark side of entertainment history. Went through some dark things you might experience if you wanted to go to the amusement parks back in the day, especially early 1900s, or if you wanted to go to the movies and you had to risk those film explosions or bombings from unions run by mobs. Figured I'd end it here on a photo of Aladdin in the Funhouse from Riverview, which I think is the most iconic ride from Riverview at this point in time. And yes, his eyes did move back and forth. Thanks, everybody.